Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Gameweek Navigators. We are into episode 10 of this season. I mean, it's been such a long preseason. It feels like I've been playing around with drafts for a long, long time. How about you, Alex? How are you doing?
I'm doing great, Sanky. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be on.
When it came to the team preview for Manchester City, right, we could not think of anyone else other than you, right? We really wanted to get you here and talk about the club, the season which went past, right, and obviously the season ahead, right. It feels such a turning point this entire season, right, because so many transfers, so many changes for a lot of clubs, and it will be something fun that I'm expecting ahead of us now.
For sure. Yeah, no, it's an interesting time at City in terms of the sort of transition that's going on, and it should make for a really fun, especially opening start to the season with the fixtures that we have and everything.
Yeah, yeah, perfect. So let's start with what is there for us today. These are the talking points, right? We'll start with a bit of a rundown on last season, right? We'll look at the key stats, and I'll ask you a bit about how City was, how the entire experience of being a City fan was last season, because I think after some time you guys were behind for, say, half a season, right? I mean, it's nothing to take credit for, but I'm going to do that. And then we'll talk a bit about the transfer window and your observations on the preseason, right? Anything key that you would like to share. And then we'll get into the fixture analysis, right? And follow it with a bit of comparison around Manchester City attackers, because I think that's where a lot of confusion is for FPL managers this season. And then we will take a look at your predicted lineup for game week one and what is there, what are the risks, etc. And then we'll close with what are the dilemmas that generally FPL managers have with respect to Manchester City. And in case there are any further questions, we'll take them. Right? Sounds good.
For sure. Sounds good to me.
Perfect. So let's start with the first slide. And this is how City looked last season, right? Goal scored 94, so extremely strong. But if you see a bit of a skew towards the home, so we have around 52 of the goals being scored at home, right? If you look at goals considered, it's more or less similar in nature, right? So City were as good at home as they were away, 33 total. So I think they were joint lowest alongside Newcastle. Right? So fairly strong defensive performance from Manchester City. And if you look at XG, there's been some strong overperformance, but I think most of it is because of world class striker that you guys have got him, who just seems to take almost every chance that he's getting, right? And so top goal scorer Erling Haaland, record breaker with 36 goals, most assists. It's Mr. Reliable Kevin De Bruyne with 16 assists. And then if you look at most minutes, Ederson and Rodri, they were obviously the rock of the team and played almost every conceivable minute. And then from attackers, I was pretty interested to see Haaland was the third highest in minutes, followed by Kevin De Bruyne, who I thought was not playing as much last season, when I was going through it. Right. So this is how the stats look. But before we get down a bit deeper, I want to know how exactly last season went for you as a City fan.
Yeah, I mean, in the Prem, you were on the opposite side of things, obviously. I mean, the first half of the season, from a City perspective, did not feel too good, in all honesty, before the World Cup. I mean, it felt like we were just chasing your guy's tail the whole time. And I mean, City have a sort of tendency in the past to start a bit slow and then continuously build on. But even back when we had all the title races with Liverpool, there was probably only the one season, I forget which exact year, where they got off to as flying of a start as Arsenal got off to last season. So that sort of pressure felt a lot different. And I think especially with, as everyone knows, the changes that happened with Cancelo mid-season and the entire shift that happened in the defense, it really sort of felt like we need a change to happen if we were going to be successful this season. And luckily enough, sort of Pep came up with a change that led to us winning the treble and led to us being super, super dominant. And so the sort of expectation in the first half of the season was really low because it did not feel like we were as dominant as in past years. And I think myself and many other City supporters always held faith that we would really work our way into a title charge, and as difficult as it may be, we would be able to compete with Arsenal and take it on to the last step as we sort of did. And then in the other competitions, it's just sort of, you never know. I mean,
Yeah,
especially in the Champions League, it's something where you have no expectation going into it, because you know how terrible it felt the past few seasons when you get
yeah,
knocked up by Madrid in the last minute, you get knocked up by Spurs a few years ago. So you sort of go into those competitions not really expecting anything, and then you just take it a game after game, and we just worked out this formula as a team where, away from home in the knockout stages, we would go and we would play for a draw, more or less, and we would be incredibly pragmatic. We would, limit the opposition to as little as possible, and then we would just have faith that when we come back to the Etihad, we would destroy everyone, and it's what happened, and it worked. So it honestly didn't feel like a treble winning season until that last month of the season when all the finals were happening, because you just can't let your expectations get that high as a supporter, or else the vast majority of the time you're going to be let down. So it felt amazing. And then obviously, as you mentioned, of course, with Erling Haaland being added in, it just added an insane new dynamic to the team, and made us more entertaining in some ways to watch than before.
makes sense. And with Erling Haaland, right? I think when he started off, while obviously he was still the main goal scorer for City, and if you see, he had a XG of around 32, right? Which is like extremely incredible, right? Everything was created around for him. But what I wanted to check was, if you if you see the start of the season, did you feel that the team was trying to adjust into this new way of playing for a particular player, of playing around a central focal point?
Yeah, I mean, even back when we had Aguero, he just acts differently to Haaland in so many ways. Where, okay, you have players like Gundogan and De Bruyne, and even Phil Foden to a degree, who were in the attack and had played with a sort of focal point striker before, but there's no one quite like Erling Haaland. And so, of course, there was sort of a learning curve to that, and I think we'll just see that continue to improve this season, where the sort of chemistry between those guys, the understanding of which patterns work best in attack, is, you know, it's just going to get better and better. It really, there's no other way for it to go wrong as you give these players more time. They're just so brilliant, and with Pep sort of guiding them along with the staff, they're just going to learn how to get the most out of each other more and more.
Makes sense. And with this, we'll get a bit into the summer transfer season, right? How has it gone for Manchester City? So we have two key arrivals so far, right? You have Mateo Kovacic, who came in from Chelsea, and you have Guardiola, much celebrated signing, and I think one of the youngest high potential defenders around in Europe, right? But if you look at the departures a bit, we lost. I think this is lag. But if you look at the departures a bit, right, you guys lost Mahrez, guys lost Gundogan, right? Gundogan at least was very key for Manchester City towards the end of the season. Right? Somehow there was a feeling among non-City fans, right? There's going to be some major transition in the City lineup this season, but that has not occurred, at least in numbers, right? How do you see this transfer window so far?
Yeah, so I'll start from a more general perspective and work my way into these two guys specifically. The thing with this transfer window is that, after winning a treble, there are, of course, going to be some players, especially the players who have been here for 6, 7, 8 seasons, who feel like they've achieved what they needed to achieve at this point. Like a player like Mahrez and a player like Gundogan, it makes sense for them to leave because they've had such a great run at City. Gundogan gets to go and play at, one of the most historical European clubs elsewhere and get coached by another brilliant, brilliant manager. And Riyad Mahrez, at the age of 32, as he's sort of moving into the sort of twilight years of his career, gets to move to Saudi League, where he is, it's sort of a better representation of his culture in a way, and it's sort of closer to home in a sense. And, both those moves from a player perspective, you understand their motivation in moving away.
Yeah,
On the flip side of things, the club has to, respond to those. They can't always just keep players. You can't force these players in. And for me, how I read it is that, last season we found a formula that worked. We found a formula that led to treble winning dominance, and in the second half of the season led us to being, just blowing out the other best teams in Europe. And so for me, like sort of as you said, we expect this sort of transition. If I were, managing City or in the sort of backroom staff at City or on the board or whatever, I would be saying that we should try to maintain that dynamic as much as possible, because we only saw it for what 3 or 4 months out of the season, from about February or March through through May. And it's almost like, if it's not broke, don't fix it. If you can keep it the way it is, then you pretty much set other teams up with the task of figuring out how to break that down. And when you have a player and manager of City's quality, that's almost an impossible task for other managers to do. So the difficult thing is that, okay, Gundogan leaves. How the hell do you replace Gundogan and the type of player that he is to maintain that balance? And it's really, really difficult. And this is the sort of thing that a lot of City fans have, especially in the past day or so, with the Paqueta links coming out last night, and just this sort of whole saga around which attacker we're going to sign. Everyone is pointing towards Phil Foden playing in midfield. And I wrote the whole thread on Twitter a few weeks ago about, how that could allow Foden to sort of take that next step into the player we all know he can be.
Yeah.
And as I've sort of sat with that idea more and more, what I've realized is that, Foden, and it sort of comes from, Guardiola saying this and me just having to agree because he says it, where Phil Foden is almost not ready for that role in a sense, because he doesn't have the defensive capabilities that Gundogan has, and he doesn't have he's more of a direct player. He likes to receive the ball in midfield and immediately turn up and sort of play in these sort of transitional moments. And it just doesn't really align with the balance that, again, if it's not broke, don't fix it. So that's where these signings come in, and this is how I sort of look at our dynamic is, to talk about Kovacic. We bring in Kovacic in a way to sort of patch up one side of the hole that Gundogan leaves, and that side is the more defensive side. It's the more sort of possession-based side of things. We've seen it in the Community Shield. We saw it throughout preseason a bit, where he likes to play deeper. He likes to come deep, collect the ball in deeper spaces, and his ball carrying is incredibly elite, and it just helps City in the first and second phase so much. Where, of course, Bernardo Silva can do that, but if you force Bernardo Silva into that role, then you have almost no other right wing option, So that's where Kovacic comes in for me. And then on the flip side of things, you lose that attacking ability that Gundogan offered. So you need to sign a player or find a player who can fit that role. And for me, Phil Foden can do that, but also someone like Lucas Paqueta can do that. And so that's sort of how I see the Gundogan void being filled, is you have these two players who come in, one of them taking over the more defensive responsibilities, one of them taking over the more attacking responsibilities. Pep selects them based on the tactical needs, game by game. And, you don't have that one player. You have to replace one player with two players. But at the end of the day, you sort of keep the same dynamic that City had last season. And the sort of knock-on effect for that is that, you look at Riyad Mahrez departing right wing. And I do think the issue with, I think if City could have found a winger who was, in the prime years of their career, could play on both sides, that we would have signed him already. But the fact of the matter is there's just not really many options out there. I really loved Rafinha as an option, but after Barca sold Ousmane Dembele, they're not going to sell Rafinha. He's their only right wing option. He just took the number 11 shirt off of Ferran Torres there. That's a no-go at this time. It's just not realistic. So City just don't have many options in the winger market, and what that leads to is you just have to look inside the club for the options. And for me, that's where Phil Foden really gets his minutes now this season. Now that I've sort of had some time to see how the transfer saga panned out, I do think Foden still gets that increase of minutes. It's just more at right wing than I initially thought it would be in midfield. So that's sort of how I see the attacking balance to go. And I do think that whether City sign Paqueta, whether we sign someone else of a similar mold in midfield, I do think that, those two incomings of Kovacic and whoever that other midfielder is really maintains the dynamic in attack that led to us being so successful last season. Yes, I would like Foden to play in midfield. Yes, I would like Grealish to have some more competition on the wing, but those things just aren't realistic when the options to fill those roles aren't there. You can't just conjure a player out of thin air. So that's how I see things on the attacking side. And then in defense, it's very simple. It's just that Gvardiol is one of the best young defenders in the world. He is almost made in a lab for a Pep Guardiola team. And it's just a replacement for Laporte that is a complete upgrade when a player is going to leave. So it's not really anything new. It's not reinventing the wheel in that sense. It's just an exceptional defender, tailor-made for our system, who provides us with this sort of next level of tactical flexibility in defense and just incredible depth back there. So that's how I see things, wrapping up altogether.
Fair. I mean, we'll move on to this next topic, but just last question, right? When you talk about the balance and the dynamics of the City squad, right? It feels like it's extremely dependent on two players, right? Haaland and KDB, right? A couple of seasons back, City always had a plan B, right? You had Gabriel Jesus coming on, you had Riyad Mahrez coming on, you had Gundogan obviously with his late runs, right? Something different to, befuddle the opposition. Do you feel it's a bit too, critically dependent on one player? Say, Haaland gets injured at some point of time. Do you think City can go back to that old plan B in some manner?
Yeah, that's a really important question. I mean, it's something that I've been asking, myself too, is that you would expect City to score about the same number of goals as we did last season, just because it's consistent. We do that, almost year on year in that sort of 90 to 100 range. And I look at what those two players who are departing contributed last season, and in the league, Gundogan had 8 goals, Mahrez had 5 goals, and they had 14 assists combined. So yeah, it's exactly what you're saying, where you lose, you not only have, more of a static dynamic up front, but you're also losing two players with tons of output, and you're not really replacing them with, okay, maybe if we sign Paqueta, he can sort of score five or so goals over the course of the season, but you need to find that output from somewhere else. And I've been wanting to write a thread on this or something because I don't really have an answer to it. It's, I think quite simply, the answer could possibly be that Erling Haaland just scores even more goals this season. And what you're saying is that plan A for City is just plan A with an exclamation point at the end, where, okay, we've lost some of these sort of role players who contribute and sort of, raise the water level of City's, goal tally. But you need to replace that in some way. And of course, I think Phil Foden can do that. Jack Grealish could improve a bit and do that. But then again, like, Erling Haaland could just score 45 goals this season. And, at this point, after seeing what he did last season, after seeing some of the games that he, some of the chances that he did miss, and seeing some of the games where he sort of disappeared a bit more,
Yeah.
I don't think many of us would put it past him to push on into that. And that sort of just makes up the deficit automatically. So that's something that I don't really have an answer to. And it is a really important question to sort of poke at throughout the course of the season, is who is going to score, the lack of goals that we're losing from these two departures.
Perfect. And before we move on, I'll just read a comment from FPL Blue Footed. He says, "Holy cow, Alex has a face and isn't just AI programmed bot with optimal city analytic capabilities. Thank God, no." Thank God, no. Yeah, we do have a face here, and I've seen you, Alexa. I think you're more on Twitter on the Spaces, right? And we have thankfully collaborated once early on into the preseason, but you have not done a lot of podcasts so far, right?
Yeah, no, I've done a few, but yeah, I don't share them as much as I should maybe, or it's also hard to like get people to go and see them. So I've done a few with video over the course of the summer, but yeah, no, it's nice to be able to come on and show my face a bit more.
Yeah, definitely. And we'll try to have you on as much as we can this season. Right now,
For
let's
sure.
get into the next slide. Preseason results, right? What was preseason all about for you?
Yeah, I mean, there isn't all that much that was sort of groundbreaking throughout preseason. I think, in the first three friendlies, we saw, we got some clarity on Kovacic. We saw that he's going to be, he excels more playing in those deeper roles. I think that was a question that a lot of people had is, can he be that more sort of attacking box presence that Gundogan is? And I think the clear answer is no, he's not going to be that at this point. That's something that's important. We saw Phil Foden play in midfield for the most part in preseason, which got a lot of us excited. And it's still like that sort of reinforces my idea that City were probably looking for a winger first, and we're hoping to play Foden in midfield, more than we may be if we sign Paqueta. But it just ended up where Foden will probably have to play more on the wing this season. That's probably a nice takeaway. And otherwise there wasn't that much more. I think Rico Lewis really stood out in the moments that he played against Bayern. He played as pretty much in the KDB role in that sort of right-sided attacking midfield spot, and he was absolutely brilliant. So something to keep an eye out with him because we know he's just going to get better and better. And yeah, there wasn't really all that much other than that. I mean, we played really well for the most part. Obviously a bit rusty, but those first three preseason games in our Asia tour were it was nice because it just sort of affirmed that, not all that much is going to change at City this season. And it just gave us a bit more clarity about where Kovacic in particular fits in. And then obviously against you guys last weekend in the Community Shield, not the result that we wanted, but I do think that, the sort of game plan worked for the most part where, from just simply a City perspective, we played in that sort of 2-4 buildup, I would describe it as, where you had two center backs flanking Ortega, and then you had this line of four where it was the two fullbacks, and you had Kovacic dropping next to Rodri. And some people were sort of making that out to be this brand new solution. And there was an excellent thread by, I forget their name on Twitter, but an excellent thread that I shared yesterday where back when we played in March or April against you guys in the final game at the Etihad, we had pretty much the same back line, and you guys employed more or less the same type of press where you would have, Jesus or Havertz as the main striker, and then you had your sort of line of four right after them. And we played with the same sort of build-up structure. So there's really not that much to take away from that, in my opinion, other than that's a really niche solution to a team that is an exceptional pressing team like Arsenal. And you just don't face those teams that often during the season. So it sort of gave a bit of clarity there as to how we're trying to work through the buildup in that sense. But it's also not something that it's not going to be applicable against Burnley on Friday, And the other thing that I do want to mention and touch on is the use of Phil Foden there and Julian Alvarez, because I was honestly shocked to see Alvarez in that starting 11 ahead of Phil Foden. I was shocked. I did not understand it whatsoever. And I still would have loved to see Phil Foden start from the beginning. But as I've thought over it over the course of the past, 3-4 days or so, however long it's been, my sort of conclusion has been that, when Alvarez plays in that second striker role, and of course we would love that to be KDB when he's fit, but he wasn't fit to start. When he plays there, he's not as direct as Phil Foden. He is very much a sort of neutral player where, I watch him play in that role, and I don't quite know how to describe him. He just sort of keeps things ticking, and he doesn't really, set the world on fire. He just does the very simple things that you would need to do, and he doesn't really go beyond that. And then you see Phil Foden come on and play pretty much. He played in that role for 5 minutes, and then we made our other sub, so there wasn't much to read on there. But Phil Foden comes on and he immediately changes the game because he gives us that spark where, exactly what I was saying before, he receives the ball and he just turns. And we're now when he spun Thomas Partey that led to us getting the Cole Palmer goal, that's what he offers. And as a manager, when you're playing in these games that force you to be more pragmatic, there's no reason to start with Phil Foden to begin with. You start with a more pragmatic system, and then exactly like we saw against you guys at the weekend, if it comes to the 60th minute or so and the game is still drawn, or we're losing 1-0, 2-0, that's when you make the change and you really bring on that firepower to be more direct. And so it's almost like, let's keep things at bay for the first 2/3 of the game. If we can get goals, perfect, but let's also just be really steady and not concede. And then later in the game, if we need to go for the win at that point, that's when you bring on your sort of difference makers. So that's something that I do think we'll see Pep continue to do in these big games against your Arsenals, against your Real Madrids, against your Bayern Munichs, all those huge teams. When we need to be more pragmatic, Phil Foden probably won't start those games because, similar to also the Champions League final, he just adds that sort of extra spark coming off the bench.
Perfect. Very nice thought. I mean, I've been telling Arsenal fans almost something similar over the last few days, saying, hey, don't expect the system that we employed against City to be, started against Nottingham Forest at home. Right? Don't
Yep.
expect Havertz there at number 9. Don't expect Declan Rice playing number 8 necessarily. Right? So there are going to be tweaks to it, and we need to understand that these two teams understand each other very strongly now, right? Having played each other and having fought with each other for a long time, and obviously the coaches know each other so well, right? So there are going to be a lot of tweaks around these games that is specifically designed for these games, right?
100%. Yeah. I mean, even we look back at the three games that we played each other in the second half of the season, and I haven't analyzed your guys' approach as much, but for us, we deployed a different system in each of those three games. One of them Rico Lewis inverted, the next one Bernardo Silva played at left back, and then the last one was more the typical setup that we saw again in the past weekend. So, yeah, exactly like you're saying, like they come up with these crazy tactical scenarios to, they're very, very niche solutions just to sort of try to one up the other guy. And it's just sort of this like 4D chess match between Arteta and Pep where they're always trying to outdo each other. And exactly, it just does not translate to every other game where, like my sort of outlook for you guys against Forest would be I would expect, one of your other strikers to start and then Havertz drop back to that left 8 role. And then maybe Party is benched for Rice because you just, they're going to play a low block. You want more bodies in attack. It just makes more sense to throw. It's the same sort of dynamic that happens at City. So yeah, 100% agree there.
Perfect. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. What do we have here? The fixtures, right? I mean, to be honest, everything looks green for City, right? But what we have here is, game week 1 to 5 and game week 6 to 10. And what are your thoughts looking at the fixture?
I think the first two matches are going to be very difficult for us. Of course, Burnley away, on paper, it's not a difficult fixture. But the reality of the situation is newly promoted team, amazing manager, very, very, sound team overall. They don't have the sort of weaknesses that Luton Town or Sheffield do. They're a very, very well put together team. They're going to be very solid and the crowd is going to be behind them. And I certainly back City to come out with a result. I know that there's the stat that every time Burnley has been promoted the past 3 times or whatever, they've gone on to beat the eventual champion in the first weekend 1-0. Streaks like that are meant to be broken. I don't take much stock into that, but it does show that, this game is going to be all but straightforward for City, where as much as on paper City match up really well against Burnley and should come out with a very comfortable victory, it is most likely going to be, quite the hard-fought battle, especially if we don't get a goal early on. And then game week 2, home to Newcastle. First game at the Etihad, of course, that sort of, it's the opposite side of things where that goes in our favor, but Newcastle are just such a good team. We saw last season, I think we drew them 3-3 the first time we played, and I forget what the second result was. They're just an incredible team, and they're very, very difficult. Huh?
I think it was 2-0 to City.
Okay. So, yeah, I mean, it's just, that's a game where, again, I would expect us to win. I would expect more of the second side of scoreline where it's, 2-0, 3-0. Again, it's at the Etihad. I back us against any single team in the world, but it's still just a very, very difficult fixture, So I hope that we start with 2 wins, obviously, but,
yeah.
I wouldn't be surprised at all if we come out of those first 2 games with a win and a loss or a win and a draw. And then after that, those next 5 games is, we'll get into the FPL specifics later, but those are the 5 fixtures that you should really be targeting City assets for. And it's difficult because I think after game week 5 and before game week 6 is when Champions League group stage starts. So it's difficult because, the rotation is going to start coming in that time. But these are the games where, City should dominate every single one of these games. Sheffield away, it's an away fixture, but it's Sheffield. They're a very, very poor team. They've lost. I think they're losing Sanderberg. They're one of their main midfielders who's
Okay.
they're just sort of in shambles at the moment, it seems. And they're going to play a low block against City, but you would back us to, come away with a win there easily. Fulham at home, same thing. Same with Forest at home. Just any home fixture for City against a team like that, you just back us to sort of demolish them. And then West Ham away and Wolves away. Again, just two teams that are sort of trending downwards. They've both, like, as you said with Wolves earlier, both teams have just lost a lot of players. And you just don't really see them proving that big of a challenge to City in these games. So, the first two games I'm a bit skeptical about. I'm not going in with my hopes high that we come out with 6 points out of those, as much as I would love that. But, those next 5 games, if City don't come away with 15 points, I will be, almost devastated at that. I think it's quite a disappointment. And then, past that, I haven't really, thought that far into, game week 8, 9, 10, because it is a ways away. And when we're thinking about FPL specifically, we probably should just sort of ignore that for now. But we then do have a really tough run, towards whenever that will be. Maybe it's end of September, early October, late October, somewhere around there. We play you guys and then Brighton and United. Those are going to be 3 really tough games where, who knows what's going to happen at that point with us. I could see.
I think those are the 3 of the toughest fixtures, right?
Yeah.
Right. Interesting. Interesting that first 2 fixtures you are not as gung-ho about City. Obviously, after that things open up quite a bit, right? So, talking about the assets a bit, right? I'm jumping the gun here, but I mean, up to game week 7, more or less, we know City are perhaps expected to win 6 and maybe draw 1 or lose 1, right? But I don't see that excitement on City assets, right? And slowly, I feel Pep Roulette is not even as strong a factor, right? But somehow that bias from last seasons has remained with us. That hey, we don't know what's going to happen. Right? What do you feel about City assets in general? Apart from Erling Haaland, of course.
Yeah, I mean, the difficult thing in attack is that there really isn't a clear option. I don't really think that in past years there ever was that much of a clear option either, besides KDB when he's fully fit, or Gundogan at the heights of his sort of periods where he's being that goal scorer. But like you look at a player like Mahrez and you think back to his FPL history, and he's never a go-to. It's not like City get a run of good fixtures and it's automatically, oh, everyone puts Mahrez in, because we all know that almost every attacker, unless it's Haaland or KDB, is going to get rotated, and you just have to hope that they spike that that brace or that hat trick in one of these games, and then it sort of makes up for it and averages it out. So in the attack, that Phil Foden is sort of the equivalent to Riyad Mahrez for me in terms of our past sort of biases towards Pep Roulette, where let's say you go into these 5 games, Sheffield away through Wolves away, game week 3 through 7, and you put in someone like Phil Foden into your team. You know that he's not going to start all these games. You can't be silly with yourself and think that. You just hope that at the end of it, you put him in for those 5 games, you hope that he just bags a hat trick in one of them and it just makes everything okay at the end of the day. That's sort of the hope for me and the perspective that you should go into it with for me. Similar with Alvarez, and I don't like the idea of starting with Alvarez. We'll get into that later, but same with him. It's a very similar idea where, like, in these 5 games, especially when City start to have UCL rotation, he's going to get a few starts. It's just a matter of, can you sort of hold your nerve, just hold him through a few benchings and just sort of, go through the plan with the idea that at the end of this, all the points should average out to being an exceptional pick. That's the thing there. So I certainly would look towards those 2 names in attack once we get into those 5 games, but I'm not bullish on starting the season with either of them, really. And then the thing with Grealish, which I know we have the stats coming up right after this. I don't want to jump the gun on that, but, he's just not necessarily, he doesn't really have the output to back up being an FPL pick in the game. And then to turn the page and look at defense, I think Stones, Diaz, and Gvardiol, and probably Akanji too, in that game week 3 through 7 run specifically, same thing with them, where all of them should be exceptional picks. Stones and Diaz especially, and Gvardiol, it's sort of a wait and see on. But same thing where, let's say you put John Stones in for those 5 games. I know tons of people are starting with him. If he starts 3 or 4 of those and gets benched for the other 1 or 2, then you just have to have the bench sort of coverage to back it up, and you just have to sort of know that it averages out in the end. That's the sort of approach that I take. You can't go in with the, as much as Pep Roulette may be overstated, you still have to go in with, your sort of expectations curbed a bit, and not expecting 5 out of 5 starts in that exceptional run, especially when Champions League is starting there. So it's sort of like a thing where I'm keen to wait a little bit, wait these 2 first fixtures out, and make my judgment then, because I could see Foden or Alvarez being, I don't really know. I'd go for Foden right now, but I could see Alvarez being a slightly more attractive pick depending on the circumstances going into this run. Again, Diaz and Stones are the top names in defenders, but I could see Gvardiol and Akanji becoming just as good of picks for this run at that time. So, and they're $500,000 cheaper. So it's just something that for me, I want to wait on a bit. And there are so many options where, if I'm giving advice for the long term, of course, it's the names like Stones, Diaz, Foden. But you look at a shorter term context like this, and the decision making is a lot less simple.
Okay, perfect. So let's get into the stats a bit and have a look at how things panned out last season, right? So what I've done is basically I've looked at some key metrics, right? I looked at minutes because it's City and everyone wants to have a look at minutes. But other than that, these are all per 90 metrics, right? Your shots attempted, shots in box, shots on target, big chances, XG, goals, big chances created, XA, and assisted. Basically, attacking metrics for us to have a look at attackers. And any person who stopped that particular metric, I've colored him in green. Anyone who's just come second, I've colored him with orange, and anyone who's come third has been colored as yellow, right? So one thing is clear when I look at all the metrics around goal scoring, right? Erling Haaland just comes out supremely top, right? What surprised me is he also came out third in big chances created. I like, okay, this is interesting. Well, he was not there in Excel, but this is interesting, right? We look at him only purely as a goal scorer, but there is a tiny bit of ability to, there is a ability, but there is a tiny bit that we are seeing, at least in last season, that he can create those big chances for them to score as well, right? Now, if you look at KDB is what we expect. Like, he's just ruling all the creation metrics, right? Now, the only thing that is a bit of an unknown for us is Foden versus Alvarez, right? And I'm only taking the players who are present this season. So I've not looked at Mahrez, I've not looked at Gundogan because it's not, there's no reason to do so in the current context. Now, Foden looks pretty decent when you look at all his goal scoring metrics. Um, but Alvarez really, really, you know, I was surprised to see him at some places come pretty close to Haaland, or the gap with Haaland and Alvarez being much stronger than anyone else in the picture, including Foden, right? So I can get a bit of sense from you when you say, hey, why don't you guys wait a bit and just see when you feel these runs will begin? Because players like Alvarez might not make a sense now, but the moment you feel that the time for him has come, you can just jump on him rather than locking yourself out with that third, maybe Ederson asset, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it happened at the end of last season too, when KDB was dealing with that injury. It was so clear that that was the time for Julian to, come into our FPL teams, because you knew he was going to get a decent amount of starts, and I reaped the rewards of that myself. I, sort of nailed the exact time period as to when that would happen, and yeah, exactly like you said, it's just waiting on that opportunity, because with Julian, the thing is that, he can only really play in 2 positions, I would say. He can play as a striker, and he can play in the sort of De Bruyne role on the right side of midfield. And the sort of caveat to that is the scenarios where potentially, like we'll see against Burnley, where you play a really, really sort of bottom of the table team, and Pep can field 2 attacking midfielders, and then you have an extra slot that Alvarez can slot into. But the vast majority of games, Alvarez only has 2 chances to get into the 11, and he's blocked off there by Erling Haaland and De Bruyne. So you really have to wait for the opportunities, whether it's rotation, whether it's injury. And of course, a lot of people sort of got ahead of themselves with the KDB injury in the beginning of this season, thinking that Alvarez would just get so many opportunities. And I don't think it'll be that straightforward. So it really is exactly like you said with Alvarez. Whenever he plays, whenever he starts, I would say that he's probably the best value asset in FPL. Whenever he starts, but that's when he starts. It's not every single game. It's not on average over the course of 38 game weeks. So it really is just finding the right moments and sort of, that's a big reason why I want to wait and see, going into game week 3 through 7 is if I see that KDB is being managed very carefully, if in these first 2 games, maybe KDB subs on, against Burnley, maybe he gets the start in the Super Cup and against Newcastle, but gets subbed early. Just however that dynamic is working out, I want to just have more clarity on, Alvarez's minutes and his role in the team. And then if I feel like the opportunity is right, you pounce on it because you just know how good he is. You look at these stats, you just know how good he is. And I think some people might look at that and think, it may be a bit inflated by him playing at striker, but I would agree with that to a sense, but he only started 5 games in spite of Haaland last season as the number 9. And of course he got minutes there, when Haaland was subbed off, but a lot of this is coming from attacking mid too. So he's very, very potent, whatever position he's in. Of course, he's much better as a striker than as an attacking mid in terms of output, but amazing whenever he plays. And then, with Phil Foden, it's a very similar thing where he has exceptional stats. And something to add with Phil Foden, when you look at his expected goals compared to the goals, is that he is a very, very stark overperformer. And he has proven that over the course of his career quite consistently. And you'll have some analytics people be like, oh no, he's always going to revert back to expected goals. But I don't believe that. I do think that Phil Foden just, has that attacking quality in him, has the ability to finish, get in the right positions, and a chance for him is not the same chance for, your average player in most scenarios. So that's the thing with Phil Foden is you can look at expected goals and he's sort of an average player in that sense, but that he has that sort of above and beyond quality, that world-class type quality where he translates that into an output that's exceptional. Like you look at the goals per 90 and none of the other attackers even come close to Alvarez and Foden for that second and third spot. It's sort of night and day there. And then there's the other thing with, to now go on to Jack Grealish. You look at the difference between Phil Foden and Jack Grealish's expected goals, and it's only 0.09. And then you look at the difference between their actual goals output, and it's 0.32. And that is monumental. That's, the main reason why Grealish just isn't an FPL pick is at the moment, and maybe he'll prove me wrong. Maybe he'll improve on this season. But he just does not translate those. He doesn't overperform pretty much. He's just an average finisher. And he's just such a secondary, tertiary figure in, our system that it just doesn't really result in him being a great FPL pick as much as he might be sort of nailed in on that spot. And then, he has Grealish has the second best, productive stats here in terms of big chances created, expected assists, but it's still nowhere near the level of KDB, where with KDB, whenever he plays, his creative stats are so high and above that it makes up for his lack of goal threat. And you just don't have that with Grealish. And that's why Grealish just really isn't much of a consideration unless you want someone to just be an average FPL asset. So, that's how I read things. And, that's exactly why that sort of, wait and see question mark is something that I'm, really keen on, approaching.
Okay, so we did have a question on Grealish and his minutes. You do believe he's nailed, right, for his position?
More or less, yeah. I think we have the same sort of dynamic that we did last season, where he's quite clearly the first choice left wing, and then our only other real alternative there is Phil Foden, maybe Cole Palmer too. Something that was interesting to me that I didn't really realize until I was doing research this summer is Grealish only started 23 Premier League games last season. He was benched in 15 games. So we sort of have this, perception that every single team sheet, Grealish is going to be on there at the left wing position. And in the most important matches, it's certainly true. But then again, he's first choice 100%. But if you're talking about nailedness, I don't think so, because he's going to be rotated there quite a bit, especially when Pep wants a sort of more direct winger and doesn't really need someone to drop that deep and possess play that much. He's just not going to start, at the levels that we saw, like Rodri, Holland, Diaz. Those types of players are just a level above anyone else, and Grealish is just very comfortably sat in that second tier for starts.
Fair,
But
fair.
yeah,
Thank you.
he's clearly first choice. It's just the term
Okay.
nailed that I always like to push back on.
Yeah, I was on Grealish train for a bit of a time, but I think speaking to you early in the preseason, I just got off it.
Yeah,
Okay,
and then
perfect.
also
So yeah,
a quick note about Bernardo, actually, real quick, because he's not really someone in many people's thoughts, but I do have got a few questions where, like, now that we've lost these attackers and that goal threat, can Bernardo be someone to make that up? And my clear answer is no, not until we see it happen. You know, you look at these stats and he's not highlighted anywhere except for minutes, and it's just very clear that Bernardo is, even when he is playing that further forward role and he's not dropping deep to help out in the first phase of possession, he still is more just like the guy that, you know, facilitates things. It's more like he moves in the right way to give the space to the other attackers to fill in. And yes, he's going to get that odd goal and assist because he's playing in the attack and it's City, but he shouldn't be in anyone's considerations until we see otherwise or are proven otherwise this season.
perfect. Yeah. So we have a comment from FPL FMFZ. Perhaps we start with Gabriel and wait on Guardiola. Yeah, makes sense. Sensible. Right. And of course, he says, "Oh, it's you, Alex." Okay, I realize now. And the second question, another question I see is Ederson nailed though? You know, there has been some rumors recently about Ortega might starting, and I remember you sharing something around it as well, right?
Yeah, and if you want to, I think there's a good time to move on to the next slide, and we
Perfect.
can talk through
Yeah,
things there. So, I mean, yeah, this is the sort of bones of my prediction for this coming week. But let's talk about Ederson, because you see that yellow bar below him, and what that means is that, in my opinion, and this is very, very, you know, speculative at the moment, I think I would sort of label it, and this is just going sort of based on the status quo, that Ederson has a 75% chance to start the season as our keeper, and Ortega has about a 25% chance to start the season as our keeper. And the thing that really riled everyone up, and you know, I put out the direct quote yesterday because I heard a bunch of people talking about the day before, and I was like, that can't be true. I heard the quote from Sam Lee, and immediately I was like, no way, people are just taking a phrase out of context. I didn't see the direct quote anywhere on Twitter, and I was thinking, okay, people are just running with this idea because he made a sort of, you know, backhand comment almost. And then I listened to the pod, and if anyone's listening and you ever want, you know, I assume most people who are listening aren't City supporters, but if for FPL purposes, you ever want to get the sort of in the know idea in a very sort of, they're typically 25 to 30-minute length, you know, podcast or whatever, go listen to the Let Me Talk pod by David Mooney, and Sam Lee is typically on it as well. And Sam Lee is the predominant City journalist. He is, if you ask anyone, he is the top name. There are a few other names as well. Simon, I don't know how to pronounce his last name. He's another great journalist. There are quite a few, but Sam Lee is the top of the top. He is so connected. He knows what he's talking about. He doesn't spout bullshit whenever he wants to. He just gives you what he has access to, and it's an exceptional resource. And so this past week on the Let Me Talk pod, when they were talking about the Community Shield, the quote more or less was that last season, he was told this at the beginning of the summer, that if Ederson had not had the exceptional performances that he did at the end of the season, including the Champions League final, including against Real Madrid, he was really good as well. If he didn't have those performances, because before that he had a long stretch of time where he was just sort of average for us and conceding a lot of weird chances, that Pep was strongly considering going into the season with Ortega as his number one. And to sort of break that down a bit, Ortega is very clearly a more consistent shot stopper than Ederson. I don't think anyone would disagree with that fact. He is, we saw some of the saves that he was making in the Community Shield. He is a wall. He makes some crazy saves that I don't see many other keepers in the world make. The difficult thing is Ederson is so good with his feet, and we know how important that is at City. And Ortega is really good as well, but Ederson is just on another level. So it's always been a question for City supporters, will Pep ever sort of sacrifice that ability with the ball at their feet for a better shot stopper? And it seems that it's something that they're really strongly considering. So Ederson is definitely not nailed. It's very clear at this point that he has very strong competition. And I do expect him to start the season as City's number one, but I do think that, I wouldn't be surprised to see Ortega start on Friday. And at the same time, if Ederson does start the season as our number one, there could always be a time where he slips up a few performances and Ortega gets that nod, because he has been absolutely brilliant whenever he's been given the chance. So that's pretty much the sort of status quo on things there. And it's something that I don't have a clear answer to at the moment. It's very much up in the air.
Yeah. I mean, generally, I just like 4.5 million goalkeepers. Just too much to go to a 5.5 million guy. But in my mind, when I was thinking about should I consider Ederson, right? He's the nailed City defender. Should I go there? In my mind, it was that Ederson has that quality, right? Where it feels like he's almost one of the outfield players for City, and he has the same aggression, same passion that you see in rest of the City players, right? He is always in sync with the rest of the team, and that was one of the reason. In my mind, in my gut, there is a slight feeling that Ederson will go back to his earlier levels. He would have obviously analyzed what happened last season. He would have realized that, hey, this is not the performance that can be expected from a City goalkeeper. And I somehow, it's a gut feeling, but I do expect that person to come back really, really strong. If I could, I would have gone there, but 4.5 million goalkeepers is just where I play. I just like to play there.
I agree. Same here, yeah. And another thing worth noting, and I guess I'll, if I should go on and talk about the prediction from here, but
Yeah.
when we did play Burnley in the FA Cup last season, and of course, Ortega was just our FA Cup keeper. It's not really anything it wasn't a tactical decision, but when we played Burnley back in March, Ortega played exceptionally well. I watched back the extended highlights of that match last night, and two of our goals in particular came from long balls that he played under pressure, pretty much the sort of like typical Ederson long ball you would expect. And one of them was to Holland, and one of them was to Alvarez when in the second half. And he played exceptionally well to sort of break down Burnley's mediocre press, I would say. So hey, I don't know. For Friday, that's something
I
to keep
hear
in
you.
mind.
I hear you. Thank you.
But yeah,
So let's get into the defense a bit because I
yeah,
see some questions around defense, right? We see one nailed player and two question marks, right? Take us through it.
yeah. So, I mean, I'll talk about Diaz versus Stones here pretty much. You see, Ruben is our first choice central center back by a very large margin. Last season, the only real competition he had for that spot was Akanji, and now he does have a bit more competition there because Gvardiol could play there exceptionally well, I believe. But that central center back role is one that requires a lot of leadership, a lot of sort of vocal qualities, and I don't think Gvardiol will take over many responsibilities there early on in his City career, just because it requires so much sort of you have to be sort of the quarterback of the defense. To bring in like an American football analogy, like you have to be the one sort of marshaling everything back there, and Diaz has that in abundance. He has those leadership qualities where Gvardiol is the new guy on the block. He's probably not going to take over there immediately. So I have Ruben Diaz probably at 90% odds to start, maybe 95% odds to start on Friday against Burnley. And the difference here, which is the sort of X minutes decision that I've probably a lot of you are wondering, Stones, I expect him to play the inverted role on Friday against Burnley, but he can also play that right center back role where there's a question mark there. He has that positional flexibility. But at the same time, just because Stones has more competition in these roles, Rico Lewis can always play there. At right center back, Akanji can play there, Walker can play there. He has a bit more competition than Ruben Diaz does for his spot, where his starting odds are 5 to 10% lower, where okay, that really only averages out to like one less start per every 10 games, maybe every 15 games. So it's not really anything to fret over when you look at like the dark green for Diaz there versus the light green for Stones. I think it's very much marginal between the two, but it's worth noting where over a longer period of time, especially with Stones' injury history, his starting odds are a little bit lower than Ruben when you compare them side by side. But Stones is playing in a more advanced role whenever he plays in this inverted role. He has a chance to get open play, goals, whereas Ruben is more just a set piece threat. So that's just, they're both great picks in FPL to sort of jump the gun on that question, because I know it's on a lot of people's mind, and I don't think you can go wrong with either. But it's just sort of the balance. Do you go for the slightly higher expected minutes player with less goal threat, or do you go for the slightly less X minutes player with a bit more goal threat? It's classic dilemma. Whichever side you go on is reasonable. For the question marks in defense, in terms of what we expect to see on Friday, at left center back, we saw Akanji there against Arsenal last weekend. I think that will be either Ake or Gvardiol. Typically we play with our left-footed player there. Akanji is just sort of the deputy if we never have someone. Ake was dealing with a knock that he picked up in preseason. That's why he didn't feature against Arsenal. But as far as I know, he's been in training, and we should get hopefully some indication from Pep in his press conference tomorrow morning about whether Ake is fit to start. But it's going to be, close to 50-50, dependent on that sort of fitness news between Ake and Gvardiol. And that's why it's sort of a no-go with either of them in FPL at the moment for me. Is just, I think Gvardiol will come out as the sort of first choice guy eventually, but will that happen from game week 1 this season? Who knows? So that's why that question mark is there. And then on the right side of defense, that could be Akanji, it could be Walker, it could be Rico Lewis playing in the inverted role with Stones drop back. Any of those three names on the right side of defense, it's sort of up for grabs there. I would probably lean towards Walker at the moment for Friday, because he started there against Burnley when we played them last season, and there's some sort of tactical ideas there of him overlapping, becoming the sixth attacker that I think are important. So I would expect Walker to start in the place of Akanji or over Akanji, but it's very much up in the air there. And as we move into the attack, obviously Haaland and Grealish are pretty much nailed in. Obviously Grealish has slightly less odds than Haaland because Phil Foden could potentially start there. And then there really are 3 question marks in the attack that are between Foden, Bernardo, Kovacic, Alvarez, and KDB. So 5 players for 3 starts. That's the job that us City predictors have for Friday. My hunch at the moment is that I think Kovacic is benched because of the way Burnley play. It just doesn't really require that more defensive profile. He quite clearly doesn't really offer the sort of box crushing qualities that Gundogan offered. And when we played Burnley last season, the attacking mid duo that Pep went with is Alvarez and De Bruyne. So he opted for 2 more attacking players, and he really tried to sort of just overwhelm Burnley with a sort of attacking onslaught of players. So Kovacic is just sort of like X'd out for me, and it automatically becomes a choice of 3 players or 3 spots for 4 players, and it's pretty much comes down to KDB's fitness, I think. I do think that I don't have them on here because I'm not confident in it enough to put them in as sort of like the locks. I do think that both Bernardo and Foden start on Friday. They could be switched around between that left attacking mid spot and the right wing spot, but I think we most likely see Bernardo at left center mid and Foden at right wing, and then Walker overlapping Foden on the right flank. And then that final spot in the right half space is just a toss-up between KDB and Alvarez based on fitness. And with the Super Cup coming midweek, I would fully expect De Bruyne to get a rest once again. I think we'll manage him, pretty smartly. So at the moment, and I do think that this is where my prediction will line up, it'll be Ederson in goal. Could be Ortega. Who knows? Just don't go for Ederson in FPL. Akanji or Ake or Gvardiol on the left, dependent on Ake's fitness. Ruben Diaz in the center, Kyle Walker on the right, Rodri and John Stones as the, Stones inverting in midfield there, and then a front 4 behind Haaland of Grealish, Bernardo, Alvarez, and Foden. That's how my prediction will likely be, come tomorrow, and I think it makes sense. But I wouldn't, when we finally get that leak on Friday and you see that Alvarez and Foden are both starting, be very, very careful about pushing them into your FPL team just for one game.
Perfect. So let's move on to the next slide then. Right. It's basically the a summary of some of the dilemmas we have had in FPL. Right. I think the first question, I don't know why a lot of people ask this question, but there are still a lot of questions. Can Haaland repeat it or can he even better it? Right. 36 goals he had last season, record breaking. Can he do the same in your mind?
Yeah, he should do more. He should be even better this season than last season, unless he gets injured. That's really the main caveat. Is he'll likely pick up an injury this season that's more severe than anything he's had at City before. It's just sort of, just time taking its toll. Over time, players are going to get injuries. Holland has gotten injuries in his career before, but whenever he's fit, he's going to produce at the same rate or better. And the thing that a lot of people are questioning is they see these performances against the biggest teams and they see Holland sort of ghosting or whatever. The thing is, you have to understand that that's a tactical choice by City, where how focused the opposition's defenders are going to be on Holland. And I think the near post on Twitter posted an exceptional thread. It was either them or this account A pieces, one of those two, both exceptional City accounts. They posted a thread about Holland's gravity and how by him attracting players towards him, it just frees up space for other City attackers to exploit. And then in turn, he sometimes gets those cutbacks at the end of things. It's just the sort of equation for City to be successful is sometimes you have to just sort of admit that Holland isn't going to be involved as much in the games. And that mostly happens in bigger games, because you come up against a team like Nottingham Forest and player like Scott McKenna or whoever is not going to be able to keep Erling Haaland out no matter how much he tries. So that's the thing there is I get the concerns when you look at his performance in these bigger games, but at the same time, City don't face that type of opposition every week. We face our Burnleys, we face our Sheffields, we face our Wolves teams. And in those games, there's almost no stopping Erling Haaland.
Perfect. And the second question, I think more or less we touched around it. So, will Foden start regularly? You expect his minutes to go up, and in which position, more or less, I think you are now inclined towards that right wing position, right?
Yeah, I think so. I think sort of like if I were to break it down into, well, I think my minutes prediction for Foden this season in the league has been 2250 to 2500 minutes. I still stand firm on that. I don't think that the inclusion of Paqueta would change that too much, which that's a nice increase from where he's been at the past two seasons.
Yeah.
And then, yeah, the positions, my initial sort of breakdown was 50% left center mid and then 25% either wing. But that sort of changed to more like 50 to 60% right wing, 25% of his minutes left wing, and then another sort of 15 to 25% coming in midfield. So that's sort of the breakdown as I see it now. So yeah, primarily right wing.
Yeah. And I think we more or less touched the third question, right, where you spoke about Mahrez, Gundogan, and how the entire mechanism will work. So I'll skip that one. But Alvarez and his expected minutes across the season, what do you expect? Which range will he go into?
Yeah, I do want to pull up. Give me a second to try to pull up this one tweet. Actually, sorry, it might take me 1 second. So there's this account on Twitter, Blue City Brian, who is a great City supporter, and he has been doing these sort of season minutes predictions for our players. And I think they're in all competitions. But at the moment, he has Julian Alvarez as having 2,500 minutes in all competitions.
Okay.
Let me just check last season how many minutes Julian played in all competitions. He played 1,500 minutes in the league, and he played. Yeah, so Julian Alvarez played around 2,000 minutes in all competitions last season and 1,500 in the league. I think that slightly increases this season. I think Blue City Brian's prediction overall is probably pretty accurate. I think in the league, he probably gets, I think maximum, unless De Bruyne or Holland pick up a massive injury, probably around 1,750 minutes in the league. And if they do pick him an injury, then he pushes on to 2,000 minutes or whatever. But yeah, I think generally that's probably the season-long expectation we should have. And I do think the reason that it'll increase is just that Kevin De Bruyne is getting older. You know, he's recovering from this injury, of course, right now. That'll play into it a little bit at the beginning of the season. But just throughout the season, you know that De Bruyne is going to be a player that, City want in the biggest of games. And in turn, in terms of league minutes, when you're playing, if you have a midweek game against Real Madrid that's sandwiched by Sheffield and Luton Town or whatever, like a very extreme example there. But those scenarios are just tailor-made for Alvarez to get, starts in the league. So that's the sort of dynamic there. I think he takes a little step up in his minutes this season, but unless one of those two names gets injured, I don't see it becoming so extreme where he just becomes, one of City's, top. That, like I referred to that first tier, second tier, third tier of minutes. Julian Alvarez is in that third tier, and he's just sort of like slowly pushing his way into the second tier.
And do we have at any point of the season, do we feel that KDB will come out as a really strong FPL option again?
My initial reaction is no, simply because of the pricing and simply because of like the management that I was talking about. I think that combination doesn't really bode well for him in fantasy. He's at a very, very awkward price point this season that, this question sort of hints at, like, what's the route to get him in? My answer to that would probably be that you don't. Like, unless you have Salah unless you start with Salah or something, or have Salah throughout the season and can easily pivot there, there's really no easy way to get to De Bruyne. And unless there comes a time where it really comes down to like assessing things in 2 to 3 game week windows, where I'm certain that at some point during the season, we'll have a run of like 2 or 3 games where we don't really have much rotation. And De Bruyne is fit. He's been playing consistent minutes. And at that point, we'll look at it and say, okay, over this next 2 to 3 game weeks, Kevin De Bruyne, we should maybe try to find a way to get him in. But generally speaking, I don't think it's something we should fret over. I think it's something to just sort of, push off to the side and leave an opportunity untaken at some points. I think in FPL, sometimes you have to just sort of, pass off on that temptation, especially with assets that aren't exceptionally highly owned. It's just, what's the real risk to it? Ignore Kevin De Bruyne and what happens? Probably nothing. And if you go for him, it's just you're setting yourself up for, okay, maybe a big spike in rank if he really explodes. But at the same time, if he gets benched in 1 out of those 3 games that I was talking about, like a 3-game run that you target, and he gets benched in one of them, it's just like, why would you go for him over someone like Rashford or Bruno or Saka or Martinelli? I can go on and on listing these players who just have slightly better expected minutes than him. It just doesn't really make sense for me. So for me, it's just, he's not someone in my thoughts at the moment. I'm sure at some point at the season we'll have a very small window to attack him, but other than that, it's very much a sort of avoid and just push out of your mind for now.
I do remember a couple of seasons back when I got that top 500 rank. I was somewhere around 2K and Game Week 36, right? Just prior to Game Week 36, City got out of Champions League, right? And everyone was like, hey, City has just started losing form. KDB has started losing steam. And I thought, hey, this is the right time because you know what? City is going to come back strong. And Liverpool were on their ass, right? And they had a double game week. They were facing Wolves. You went in. I got KDB on a hit and captained him because I knew the minutes were secured, right? So yeah, it just makes sense that maybe some special scenario comes in and you see that minutes gets a bit more solidified. But unless you don't, just stay out of it. There's no harm. There's no big harm as such because his ownership is always going to stay low this season at least.
Yeah, perfect example there. And another thing that I do want to note that's not really FPL related at all, it's just sort of a hunch that I have, is that this season, with the sort of weight of the trophies being lifted off him, I think he felt a lot of pressure on that. He just seemed sort of stressed out last season in a way where, like, I haven't really seen De Bruyne that way. And just sort of seeing the bits of him playing so far this season, I think that we'll see a slightly different Kevin De Bruyne this season, in the sense that he's going to be playing with a bit more joy and a bit more sort of freedom. And maybe that bodes well for FPL, in the sense that he's going to be taking a bit more risk and trying to play those crazy passes that he can, rather than just facilitating. But I just wanted to note that I do think this season we'll see Kevin De Bruyne play with a bit more joy in his game than we've seen recently.
Makes sense. I think fans across clubs love KDB as a player, and he's
Yeah.
genuinely one of the best attacking players that Premier League has seen. And if we see him with a wider smile on his face, something for the good as well.
Yeah, if you're a team, if you're an opposition team and you come up and you see De Bruyne smiling at you, the game's almost already over.
Yeah, definitely. So the final question, and you touched upon it a bit, I think for the coming weeks, Ruben Diaz or Stones, right? But do you think across the entire season, is there going to be one standout asset, someone this season we can rely on?
Yeah, so the thing that I'm most interested to see is how Gvardiol is introduced to this side. And I'll come back to that in a minute. So the advice that I would give is what I said earlier, where if you want to start the season in FPL with any of these guys, at the moment with what we know now, John Stones and Ruben Diaz are the best picks. Ruben Diaz has the highest expected minutes of any City defender. I expect him to, I don't love to. I saw someone asking like how many starts Stones gets in the first 5 games.
Yeah.
I don't love answering those types of questions, because I honestly have no clue. Because come game week 3, we could have an injury in defense and the entire scenario has changed. But to give like a general expectation, out of the first 8 games, and just looking at that like 8-game period is like the typical first wildcard period, I think Ruben Diaz probably gets 7 starts plus or minus 1. I could see him maybe starting all 8, and I think at a bare minimum he starts 6 of those games. So that's how safe Ruben is for minutes. And with John Stones, it's pretty much the same. I would say like 6.5 games for Stones would be my mark. It sort of goes back to that, like the percentage 1 in 15, 1 in 10 thing I was saying before, where 6 or 7 starts out of the first 8 for John Stones, maybe 5 at the very lowest. His range is a bit more volatile than Ruben's, but I expect him, if I had to just guess a number, I would say 6 out of 8 starts for Stones in the first 8, 7 out of 8 starts for Ruben Diaz in the first 8. And the good thing with both of them in fantasy is they don't sub on when they're benched all that often. I'll pull up the exact stats from last season to back this up and like prove that I'm not waffling here. But last season, John Stones only got subbed on twice when he was benched. One of those was coming back from injury. Another one of those was in like one of the throwaway games at the end of the season after we had already clinched the title against Chelsea, I'm pretty sure. And Ruben Diaz got subbed in 4 times over the course of the season, but I think 2 of those were due to injury, and the other 2 of those were sort of more when we just needed to really shore up our defense to see out a game at the end of it. So generally speaking, and it's a really good quality to have in FPL, that when these guys do not start, they probably won't get subbed in. And so if you are picking John Stones or Ruben Diaz to start the season and you're planning to hold them over, until you wildcard, make sure that you have proper bench depth, because they will get benched at certain points. And when they get benched, you want a player like maybe like Udoji at 4.5, or maybe like a Crystal Palace defender or Aston Villa defender, someone to just sit on the bench who is very sure for starts, that will come in for those players whenever they eventually get those, benching. So that's the general sort of outlook for John Stones and Ruben Diaz to start the season. Both great picks in fantasy. I'm personally waiting two game weeks to decide which one of those guys I want in. And the main reason for that is the 2 other names that I would keep an eye out on, and that's Joshko Gvardiol and Manu Akanji. I'll start with Akanji because it's pretty much the same thing we saw last season, where when Champions League rotation starts, especially, Akanji is a great pick in FPL. Sort of straddles that line between first choice lineups and second choice lineups, where sometimes we have a lot of different first choice defensive setups right now, but Akanji at right center back is, probably our best option there if Stones is inverting. And Pep starts Walker in that role way more than I would like him to, but Akanji is by far the better option in most senses there. And when we do rotate, when you have those games where, as I said, like if Diaz is benched as the central center back, it's either going to be Akanji or Gvardiol playing for him there. If John Stones is benched, then Akanji's starting odds go up a bit more. So he's just that person where when push comes to shove in those rotation heavy windows, he's a player that is I really like as an FPL pick at 5 million, just because he gets into a lot of these games, and especially thinking like when we do have those rotation games, a lot of the games that Pep rotates, it's the easier games, the games that you would back us to get a clean sheet in more likely. So that's why I really like Akanji as a pick, and especially when I'm talking about that game week 3 through 7 window when Champions League rotation starts, I just think Akanji might end up being a really, really good pick there for that run and could really rival, Stones and Diaz at 500,000 more for that spot. And then the thing with Gvardiol is that we know how good he is. We know that City aren't buying a player who's like the second most expensive defender ever for no reason. He's going to be first choice sooner or later. I think we all know that. And
Yeah.
the FML FPL boys were going on about this in their pod yesterday, where there's no reason he should have been priced at 5 million in FPL. It's a joke. He should be 5.5. It is absolutely absurd. The thing with Gvardiol is there's just no reason to start the season with him. Even if you get a leak that he's starting against Burnley, I wouldn't go for him straight away because you just don't really know how that dynamic is going to pan out. Because a really difficult thing for Pep to figure out is there's not a clear option to start both all three of Ake, Gvardiol, and Diaz. There just really isn't a great system to start all three of them, especially when you're starting John Stones as well. So it's something to sort of wait and see on, but be ready to pounce on that opportunity as soon as it comes. So that's why I'm really waiting to buy into this defense. Is I have a player like a Estupinian in my team who has 3 exceptional fixtures and then kind of drops off from there. And I just know that at 5 million, especially if I'm keeping 500,000 in the bank or something, I just have my choice of those 4 City defenders for that juicy game week 3 through 7 run, where as much as I probably still will go for someone like John Stones, I want to leave that opportunity open for me to go for a Gvardiol or go for, a Kanji. And one more thing to add with Gvardiol is he might have more, like, Gvardiol might be the most attacking defender City has seen since Cancelo. I would probably put my money on that because his ability going forward is crazy good. It's so insane. So I'm really interested to see how Pep plays him there. Whether we'll play with like 2 wide fullbacks who push on equally, whether Gvardiol ever plays as like this one, sort of wing back bombing forward or something. Who knows? But that's something to keep in mind that, John Stones does have a good amount of attacking threat, but Gvardiol at 500,000 cheaper could have another level of attacking threat, and that would just make him the standout pick potentially long
Perfect.
term.
Thanks a lot, Alex. It was a long answer, but a lot of insights came out of it. Right.
Yes.
I think this brings us to the close of this episode. But one last question, right? Just yes or no. Come game week 1, are you going to captain Erling Haaland?
Yes. So, yeah, should I break it down a bit more?
No, no, no. Let's keep it there, right? It's Erling Haaland. Not much to explain. So thanks a lot, Alex. I think you gave us a lot of time. We went, I think, 20 minutes overboard, but it was so nice talking City with you, and talking a bit of football is always lovely, right? I'm glad that the audience got to see your face and got to hear you talking football as well, apart from seeing your lovely threads, right? And to everyone there in the audience, please, give this a like if you like this episode. Give this a like, follow it, share it with your friends, and we hope to bring more and more such quality content across the season. Right? All the best, Alex, for the FPL.
Thank you so much. Great having me on, Sangi. I hope to be back here soon enough again.
Definitely. Thanks a lot, man.